Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I direct events here at The Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Marilyn Hacker and Karthika Nair's new collection, A Different Distance, I'd like to share a little bit of history about The Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after over 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Excuse me. Without our loyal community of book lovers, booksellers, and the time of authors like Marilyn, Karthika, and Salil, we wouldn't be here today. And we are so truly appreciative of all of you. Today, we are thrilled to have with us Marilyn Hacker and Karthika Nair for the discussion of their new poetry collection, A Different Distance, Arenga. In March 2020, France declared a full lockdown to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Shortly thereafter, poets and friends Marilyn and Karthika, living mere miles from each other but separated by circumstance and inspired by this extraordinary time, began a correspondence in verse. Renga is an ancient Japanese form of collaborative poetry. From the plague spring through a year in which seasons are marked by the waxing and waning of the virus, Hacker and Nair's Renga charts the difference and sames of a now shared experience. Marilyn Hacker is the author of 14 books of poems, including Blazons and A Stranger's Mirror, a collaborative book, Diaspo Renga, written with Dima K. Shahabi, and an essay collection, Unauthorized Voices. Her 18 translations of French and Francophone poets include Claire Melrose, Daybreak, Jean-Paul de Dadelson's That Light All at Once, and Samira Negrush's The Olive Trees Jazz. For her own work, she received the 2010 PEN Volcker Award and the International Argana Prize for Poetry in Morocco in 2011. She lives in Paris. Karthika Nair is the co-author of A Different Distance. She is a poet, fabulist, and librettist whose books include The Honey Hunter, illustrated by Joël Jolivet, Until the Lions, her reimagining of the foundational South Asian epic in multiple voices, won the 2015 Tate Literature Live Award for Book of the Year, was shortlisted for the Atta Galata Prize, and highly commended in the 2016 Forward Prizes. Nair has scripted and co-scripted performances for choreographers Akram Khan, Sidi Larbi Cherkaoui and Damien Jallet, and Carlos Pons Guerra. She is the co-founder of Cherkaoui's Antwerp-based dance company, Eastman, and executive producer of several of his and Damien Jallet's works. Joining Marilyn and Karthika in conversation is Salil Tripathi. Salil was born in Bombay, India, and now lives in New York. He was chair of PEN's International Writers in Prison Committee 2015 through 2021 and is now a member of its board. He is a contributing editor at the Caravan and Mint in India and has written for Foreign Policy, The Wall Street Journal, NYR Daily, The Washington Post, New York Times, and other publications in the UK, where he lived from 1999 through 2019, and Asia. In the 1990s, he was a foreign correspondent for Far Eastern Economic Review and others based in Singapore. His books include Offense, The Hindu Case, Detour, Songs of the Open Road, and The Colonel Who Would Not Repent, The Bangladesh War and Its Unquiet Legacy. He is also writing a book about the Gujaratis. His essays and poems have appeared in several anthologies dealing with freedom of expression. In 2015, he received the Red Ink Award from the Mumbai Press Club for Human Rights Journalism. In November 2011, he won the third prize at the Bastiat Awards for Journalism about Free Societies in New York. In 1994, in Hong Kong, he received one of the awards at the Citibank Pan Asia Journalism Awards for Economic Journalism. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Salil, Marilyn, and Karthika to the stage.
It's lovely to be with all of you on what is promising to be a sunny afternoon in New York, and I hope wherever you are, sun will always shine. And it's wonderful that we can all meet together. It's a pity that Karthika, Marilyn, and I can't be in the same room, but that's the nature of the beast we are dealing with today. Uh, I want to talk a little bit about the book first, and then I'm going to start asking questions. And I won't take too much of your time because I know what you want to listen to are Marilyn and Karthika's words and not mine. But here's the book, and do order it, do get a copy of it because it's an amazing response to a global tragedy by two sensitive souls who have felt extremely passionate, disheartened, and at the same time looking forward to a better tomorrow about the situation and the condition in which we live today. I always think of what Joyce said about exile. You know, what Joyce said is that, you know, a writer in exile basically relies on three things: silence, exile, cunning. Now, silence we can overcome because of WhatsApp and Signal and all these other devices today. Exile is forced upon us, or sometimes we choose to do it. And cunning is something, I don't know how to get into that. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that what we are dealing with. Writers do need solitude, but this is an enforced solitude. It keeps them within their homes, which seem like cages. Because while the writer was very happy to be inside a room, suddenly now there's no choice but to stay within the room. And therefore, when it is imposed from an external party, it becomes harder. Social interaction matters. I'm still puzzled. I was talking to my friend Amitav Ghosh, the leading novelist from India who lives not barely a mile away from where I do in Brooklyn. But Amitav used to say that, you know, why do we keep talking about social distance? Why can't we talk about physical distance? Because socially, we are always together. But anyway, regardless of that, the fact is that we are distant from people, and therefore there is an absence of touch, absence of warmth, absence of intimacy, absence of laughter. We expect the cables that carry our conversation across to one another through words, through emails, through letters, or through conversations to sustain us. But we all know it's not the same thing at all. So this technology is now creating an illusion of intimacy about us, but it still imprisons us in our boxes. So what I want to know more about is how the writing has emerged from the pandemic. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week which looked at the literature that came out of the pandemic. It expressed a lot of disappointment, which is nice because journalists are not chroniclers, writers are not chroniclers, fiction writers are not chroniclers of what happens per se, but that's not their role, that's not their calling. And there have been wonderful pieces and diaries in the New York Review of Books. Poetry has come out of it, some poetry that has rattled people. Both Karthika and I come from India, and we are aware of a Gujarati poet called Parul Kakkar. She wrote this one poem which rattled the government about what was happening with the pandemic. So I think it's worth bearing in mind. And of course, there are old classics like Decameron of Giovanni Boccaccio, and of course, Albert Camus' The Plague. When I read the book, what I found the most interesting thing was how you can maintain the intimacy and friendship when you're not able to meet someone through what seemed like epistolary communication, but actually it picks up one conversation from another and takes it in a direction which was never expected. And at the same time, there are some certain areas of focus. Karthika, of course, your poetry deals with South Asia. How could it not? And same with you, Marilyn. Of course, the US matters, but in your case, so does the Middle East. And so it's very interesting to see how we might be ensconced and imprisoned in a particular space, but still we are able to relate to a world beyond us. The themes that emerge: governmental callousness, governmental rule-making, which pushes us into a corner, the irony of curfews. Very often it is more for theater than for actual purposes. But it's also the irony that people have always lived with in countries like Lebanon and Syria and so on. The lives of emergency workers, that's something I learned so much from Marilyn, your writing, because you're writing about someone from within your family about it. And in particular, the medical staff, both of you have had different kinds of exposures to it. And how you sustain yourself in that kind of an isolation, not being able to meet someone, hug someone, be with someone, it's important. And therefore, it's going to be a very interesting and lively conversation. I hope so as we go along. I've already spoken too much. And there's already a question from the audience. I want to put it up front because it's a good defining question before we go on, which is, what is a Renga? And it's a question that was directed to you, Marilyn. So if you want to define it, this is your moment, and then I'll go to my question. Yeah.
Yes,
I can't hear you. Sorry.
Well, is this better? Sorry.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, Mumtaz. The Renga is an ancient Japanese form of communicate of collaborative verse. The poems are syllabic. And the idea is that each poet writes a tanka or two tanka, and the tanka is made up of what almost everyone knows, the haiku form, which is it's syllabically, at least in English, 5 syllables, 7, and then 5, and then a sort of couplet of 7 syllables, 7 syllables. And so in the Renga, there each poet does 2 of these, and then the second poet picks up a word or a phrase from the last line and starts her or his poem with that. And often it involved more than 2 people, and often 7 people sitting in a room together, drinking sake perhaps, and passing, writing in their notebook or passing a single notebook around. Whereas we, of course, because of the circumstances, we're doing this on a computer screen. And if we were drinking, whether it was sake or tea or just a glass of water, we were drinking it alone.
Right. So yeah, the haiku is, of course, 575, and this is 57577. And of course, it becomes harder when you try to measure the syllables, because the cadence of the language varies. And we Indians tend to speak so fast that sometimes they become one. But anyway, but that's one. This was a question from Patricia Brody. I should acknowledge that, and thank you for that. Now, my first question is very straightforward and basic. What led you to this project? Did you at all plan it, or did it emerge? And related to that is, do you see Renga as a relay race, as a tennis match, or what we in India call Antakshari, which Karthika would be familiar, but basically it's I sing a song and you pick up and start with a new song, which starts with the last syllable that I had uttered, and then you sing your version, and I pick the last syllable of yours and continue. And I'm rather good at it, I must admit, even if it sounds boastful, and I can go on for the rest of the night with you if we were to have the race. But I'm just curious. So if you can address both of that, and this is a question for both of you. Yeah.
Very much the last. That means
Sabir has to give us 7 more hours for this session now, right?
I have a small variation. Not the Antakshari quite subtle, but the Jugalbandi.
Yeah.
Where you're going to pick up and you're going to then take your own variation from the same rhythm and go into another segment, and that conversation continues with all the variations and the riffs that implies, but with a steady underlying connective thread.
And I can assure our listeners today that that's exactly what this book does. That you do see a continuity, although the 2 people haven't met. So tell me, what led you to the project? Was it pre-planned, or did it emerge on its own?
Well, no, it certainly wasn't pre-planned, but I actually suggested it to Karthika at one point, because we were, as everybody else was, especially people who live alone, as we both do, stuck on our own, but communicating via email or telephone, email, WhatsApp, what everybody had left for human communication. And fortunately, email is perfectly adequate for doing the equivalent of writing something on a tablet and passing the tablet to the next person. And so it wasn't a paper. It wasn't a paper tablet or a stone tablet. It was IBM tablet. But that was what that was what we did. I sent one off to Kartika, and she sent one back, and then we were going.
Yeah, and there's a question from Julie Fay, which is that are these two poets in the same room or in separate residences? Right now, I imagine you are in the same room. Am I right?
Yeah.
Today we are, but during the course of the book, the year and 2 days in which the book was written, we only met thrice, and 2 of those meetings were via Zoom. So we only met physically once between March 29, 2020 and 31st of March 2021, which is when the book finishes, when the chronicle ends.
Yes. And you don't want to give away the secret. We are going to come to that when you met again. So I'm going to hold that in abeyance. But Tipu Purokashta, thank you for reminding everyone that Bengal has a version of this kind of exchange, and it's called Kobir Lodai, which is the Battle of the Poets. But one thing I can say, having read the book and knowing both of you, is that this was not a battle; it was an exchange. I think I should clarify that. Yeah. Turning to my next question, and this is when and how did you know each other? I know neither of you is French by birth, but you do live in Paris. And when and how did you meet, and how did you get to know each other?
Well, I'll start because I'd been reading Marilyn's work and attending her readings long before she knew I existed. But we met at a mutual friend's place who'd given Marilyn a copy of my first book, Bearings, and who very, very thoughtfully arranged a sort of delicious high tea for her 2 cats and 3 or 4 writers.
Yeah. And what inspired you to use Renga as a form? I mean, could it not have been sonnets one to another, or prose poems? And what liberties did you take with the medium, if you did any?
I think because the Renga form has such a history of collaboration, and sometimes collaboration of people in the same. Sometimes people collaboration of with a political overtone as well. While we both have written sonnet sequences, and I even ages ago did in fact work on collaborative sonnets, that seemed a bit. Well, I frankly didn't even think about sonnets, but it would seem. Seems, I mean, not that the sonnet is heavy, but to have to produce one and then send one, whereas there's something message-like about the tanka. It's extremely brief. There are rules, but they're comparatively simple. It can encompass really anything. You can spend as much time doing it, or you could toss one off very quickly, and depending on the circumstances and depending on the mood. And I think that all went into that choice.
Yeah, it was I think, I mean, Marilyn suggested it to me, so I don't know what, actuated her thinking, but for me, it just felt very organic. Renga is historically the sort of the most, the oldest, but also the most sort of, I guess, in that sense, the most popular form of epistolary poetry. And I'll sort of make a rather irreverent analogy and say it's the difference between an SMS and a voice message, where you traditionally the SMS, if you remember, had 180 characters or something back in the day, when we first started with that. So there's a certain I guess distillation of thought which is really required with the tanka that constitute a renga, which are sort of the constituent elements of a renga, which really appealed to me in a time when I wasn't capable of much expanded thought.
Since you mentioned Tanka, there's a very nice question. I have my own script, of course, but I'm going to be acutely aware of what people are asking on the chat. And Elizabeth Frishaw has just asked a question, and she spoke about Tanka, so I thought I should turn to you. Either of you can respond. That do you find that the haiku and Tanka form lends itself to especially to chronicling, almost like headlines with a bit of fleshing out?
Yes, I think it does.
It's a really relevant question. I hadn't thought of it quite consciously, but now that Elizabeth says it, the last time I did an entire haiku sequence was actually when I was at the Songshan Temple in Henan, which is a Shaolin temple, where we were for the making of a production, and I chronicled that entire time in a series of haikus because it just seemed very very felicitous a manner to respond to a certain environment. And in this case, it was totally different. It was not exactly peaceful with the pandemic, but headline with a bit of fleshing out, or again, I'd say the essence of something. It's almost like putting thought in a decanter.
And I had done something similar a few years ago with Dima Shihabi, who is a Palestinian poet who lives in the United States, and this was done entirely. Well, so was ours. Likewise, done entirely.
So you're breaking off. You might have to repeat what you just said.
And it was something that started with one of the. Sorry.
We lost you for part of your last part, but yeah. So if you want to repeat the last part, yeah. Last two. Yeah.
I said that having also done a book-length renga with Dima Shihabi, who is a Palestinian poet who lives in the United States, but she is Chazawi, and most of her family is in Gaza, and we started writing this during one of the interminable and it seems endless Israeli bombings of Gaza in. I guess we started it in 2013 and did it for a year, and that was published also.
Norbert Hershon, who's with us in the audience, reminded that Somali and Yemeni poets also have similar ways of addressing it, and it requires quiet companionship. And Norbert, I know you're listening to this. I want to tell you that quiet companionship is such a powerful word. So thank you for saying it in those terms. But Sanjoy Roy has a question that both of you enjoy writing poetry with formal compositional rules, which is of course Tanka and arguably sonnet and arguably haiku and all the other. But can you tell us more about why, rather than more free verse? Where does the form and the substance, what is the relationship between them? I'm paraphrasing it now, because his question is, what does a composition of different kind, which is strict grammar and strict rules of it, what does it bring to the table? And do you have a favorite form?
Well, one of the things that I like about so-called, well, no, not so-called formal poetry, whether it's Renga or whether it's Sestino or Canzoni or whatever, is that the form often engages the poem with language, and sometimes often, and the best takes it where you didn't know it was going to go. It's not all willed. The languages, or rather, the language is doing some of the willing. There's somehow the consciousness of the language, or the consciousness of and perhaps if you have more than one language, the consciousness of the languages behind the language are all taking part in the composition of the poem somehow.
Karthika, do you have any thoughts to add, or yeah?
Yeah, I mean, it's really quite similar to what Marlon said. There's of course that very important aspect, and for me, it's also a shorthand for inhabiting voice. And as Sanjoy knows, it's primary. It helps me a great deal in assuming different voices, which is what I've often used it for. But it's almost I keep giving analogies to architecture. A house is built in a different way than a library, than a hospital, than an opera house, and I find that form helps me to inhabit a certain space, whether it is in a narrative voice or it is the space covered by the poem with sort of greater precision. And whether we have favorites, I think it really depends on context. There are things that a ghazal will do very differently to what a pantun will do, or what in this case a renga, even if it weren't a renga and collaborative, what it would have done as a series of tanka is very different from what a series of sonnets would have done in that particular time and place specifically also.
Now, this is a question which is basically a question about your book and how did each of you cope during the year? And you can talk about what you've written in the book, or you can talk about things that you left out of the book, both of you, yeah.
Could we start with a reading? Because some of it will be self-explanatory.
Lovely, let's do that. This is the time to do the reading.
And remind us of your question if we forget.
Sure, yeah, no, I'll highlight the question on my notepad, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this little section starts, in fact, with the first time we actually met. It was in July. It was the first time we'd met since January, which is a long time for people who live within walking distance of each other in the same city and like each other. And it was in fact at a bookshop for a reading. 4 o'clock, sunshine on the Seine. The bookshop's a beehive. Kartika is here and I'm here. First time we've met since January. In a room above the river, we record for the Bengaluru festival she can't attend. Then we sit at Panis with hot chocolate, black coffee. She takes off the mauve silk scarf round her head and lets the sun soothe the scars, tease the hair stubble to grow. 26 July 2020.
Stubbly, the teasing, the banter, the laughter, sweet nothings we had grown unused to, locked down all these months. This reading recording first with Marilyn and Adam and an unseen pianist upstairs at Shakespeare and Company. My favorite Wednesday this year. Then a slew of Rathuwai, its English sibling Feeble, all week, spotlit by the same sun and often hot chocolate. 31st July 2020.
Foot hot in its brace for a stupid broken bone propped on a cushion. I'm back and forth on WhatsApp for 6 hours. 2 explosions on the port. Half of Beirut blown up. Germaise, Burj Hamoud. We're safe, in shock, the windows shattered. War zone cell phone videos. The bride in white lace hijab, blown down in her gown, is a doctor who was in an ER 6 hours later, triaging stretchers. 6th August 2020.
The triage stretches through the night on Kozhikode Airport's tarmac, then in ERs of hospitals across 2 neighboring towns. Volunteers battling manic rains and a raging virus seek voices beneath the debris of 190 lives fleeing COVID-19 from Dubai. 18 dead and 120 injured. Amma, were there people you... She replies, they were all someone's blood, child. 9th August 2020.
Someone's child, someone's uncle, sister, son. Were they blasted, infected? The disasters converge. while Katya sends me a WhatsApp photo, bottle of white wine I left in the fridge on Medici Street. I've packed your books and clothes. We'll drink the wine when you come back. 17th August, 2020.
When you come next, we'll drink a beaker of sunset by Velaini Lake. Then his voice clouds. That won't be likely this year, will it? Buoyant since birth, my dad held on to hope all these months. A surefire cure, tests, vaccines. His belief now flags after the morning news. 23rd August, 2020.
No more rainbow flags. Les Mots à la Bouche bookshop has been replaced by another Doc Martens store, and the Moroccan grocer by Princesse Tam Tam underwear, one of 3 clones in 10 blocks. I don't want to walk down the Rue Sainte-Croix de la Bretonnerie, where sometimes I go near midnight and browse, come home with that new novel by Nina Borawi and grapefruit juice for the morning. 23rd August, 2020.
Grief stains the morning like grape, overripe the tongue, purple, glutinous. Grief stains their voices. Achinanama live, relive, loss each time I call. 3 deaths in 2 days, old, dear friends. 40 and 60-year-old kinships, their markers of being. Grief edged by new enforced distance, by the lack of touch, of last rites. Grief clogs, till Swarup YouTube streams a funeral. Life seeps back into their chords. 31st August, 2020.
I mean, what comes through very vividly is the isolation and the idea of stepping out of the cocoon in which you're forced, and the balloon becomes a prison in a way. And, you know, Marilyn, one of the things I noticed in most of your poems was the frequent references, and very positive references to food and coffee and so on, which was wonderful, absolutely. Because, you know, you could see what you were missing. Patricia Brody again is commenting, this form works so beautifully to invite the reader or listeners into the correspondence. And Patricia, I can assure you it is right. I saw the book when it was complete. You know, I do know both the poets, but I hadn't seen any of the Rengas before. So you discover Paris in a physical sense and Paris in an emotional and in an intellectual or mental space. Yeah. I have a very broad-ranging question, and in a way, that's what the book is about. How did you cope with the year? You're welcome to offer your thoughts on that, but I do urge everyone to look at the poems themselves, because they tell you not only about what's happening to them, to those that they love, and to those that they care for. And I think it's important to make those distinctions, because it talks about both the family and the society. And you know, Madeline, you have American heritage, and America was going through a huge tumultuous year last year about the kind of America it wanted to be. And of course, Karthika, you are from India, and you of course had to, I mean, very vivid poetry about people who were marching and going away because of these lockdowns which were enforced without any sense of rational explanation about why they were being imposed. And this is not to suggest that one is anti-vax or anti-lockdowns, but the fact that it was being created without a safety net, and that comes very, very vividly. Now, one of the things I wrote in a report for PEN, where I used to chair the Writers in Prison Committee till last September, was how writers began to realize what it means being imprisoned, but only just so. It's very cute to say that because of lockdown, you're at home and you're writing, but we were still free to get the groceries we wanted. They were delivered to us. We could binge watch on Netflix or Disney Plus or Willow, the cricket channel. Or
we could go out and take a long walk, even
absolutely with a mask. Absolutely. And you know, there were other people who are far more vulnerable than us who are taking the risk of bringing us our food and the goods that we wanted to buy at the click of a button on the website of Walmart and Amazon. And we could pick up the phone and call friends and family. All those liberties were still there. But the writer who's actually in prison doesn't have those freedoms, because he or she is completely at the mercy of what people want their lives to be. So what kind of constraints did you feel?
Touch went missing. I think that was true for many people, and in unexpected ways. I mean, I remember one of the nurses. It wasn't even related to whether you were living in a unit or not. So there were a lot of nurses who would not go to their family. I mean, they would be in the same house, but they'd stay away because they were just so scared of infecting vulnerable people, etc. So I think to varying extents, all of us were deprived of touch. And that was quite poignant. I remember one of my referral nurses just feeling the frustration so much also of not being able to hug her patients. She's someone who's very tactile, and touch is such an analgesic when you have pain that just cannot be taken away by any kind of drugs. It is what binds us together as a species. Touch really went missing, but in so many other ways, as you said, Salil, we are the privileged. I mean, we had in again to differing degrees, we had contact, we had solidarity. I mean, solidarity was huge. So sort of solidarity between groups, within groups, between groups, even when our governments functioned or dysfunctioned to varying degrees.
Yeah, and both, I mean, just to build on that, I mean, both of you have very generously contributed to a book that I've been editing with the Indian artist Shilpa Gupta on imprisoned poets. And is it even fair to compare what the imprisoned poet is going through?
No, absolutely no.
Absolutely. Because I do want to draw you on that, because there is this libertarian ethic and ethos of challenging the state and saying that my human rights are violated. And I think it's too precious to say that, when there are real people whose real human rights are violated when they are being incarcerated. So just wanted to know your reflections on that. Yeah.
I've just come back from London where I heard that a lot. And we do have a small but very vocal minority in France also that is going on about how this is an impingement of basic human rights, etc. And I mean, it infuriates me on various levels, but I also want to say, human rights, citizens' rights come with responsibilities, and there's a responsibility to each other. My freedom is also about protecting yours.
And although certainly not to the extent that you have, but a couple of times when I lived in the United States, thanks to the poet Irena Klepfish, I went and worked with women writers in prison, which is that is to say, went to Bedford Hills and gave a reading and led a workshop and talked to imprisoned women who were writing, or imprisoned women writers, some of whom were political prisoners, in fact, that was just a different category of experience.
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely the case. When people think they're martyrs, when they're not real martyrs, I always remind writers of that. Just to share an anecdote, I think about 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I used to work with Amnesty International. And one of the projects I was working on was Conflict Diamonds. And I lived in London in those years. And I was at an event where someone came and said that, I'm very upset that Britain is imposing all these security cameras to mark my license plate when I'm driving to see whether I'm speeding or not and fine me. Isn't that a human rights violation? And he thought I would say, yes, of course, it's a violation. And at one level it is, of course, but there are degrees, right? So I said, we are still trying to fix torture. So let's fix torture first, then we'll deal with your case. That's what I had to tell him. So I just thought I had to share that. I hadn't planned it, but I thought it was an appropriate time to talk about that. Karthika and Madeline, both of you spoke to the wonderful Indian poet Arundhati Subramanian a couple of days ago, where she was talking in a grander sense, but you brought it down to the level of chronicling this time. So can you tell me, A, what chronicling meant for you? And it's a question actually for both of you. And when did you know you had reached the end point for this book? Because, I mean, we are still in semi-lockdown situation with the Omicron virus variant and so on. Yeah.
So what does chronicling mean? It meant a great deal because, as you know, Salil, having read the book, there's pain, there's annoyance, there's rage, frustration for all the things that we've talked about, but there's also a lot of everyday wonder, and that's important. I mean, we talked about solidarity. This for me was a year that I survived, that I thrived in many ways only thanks to solidarity, whether it was the hospital network and professionals who went way beyond their call of duty, or it was my kin, my found family, and people who did everything they could to make sure that my everyday was sustained with some degree of comfort within all the constraints we had. Because in Paris, we had a very severe lockdown. The first phase, you couldn't go beyond a kilometer radius, and you could not, the window of time we had allowed to us was 1 hour a day. And my hospital gave certificates, etc. But I had around a dozen friends and former colleagues, who sustained my life. And it meant a lot to chronicle those moments of laughter, of kindness, of irreverence, because at the end of the day, I think we need to remember the good things as much as the other.
Ellen, yeah.
I was in a more fortunate health situation than Kartika. I'd been there, done that, but many years ago, and so paradoxically, that meant I didn't get to see as many people. There were still a few friends whom I would meet outdoors. We would take walks, and since fortunately for us, the lockdown started at the beginning of spring. In fact, I came back from Lebanon just in time to be locked down, but otherwise it was on practically the last plane out of Beirut. So there was at least the possibility of taking a walk with someone along the river, or walking around the park 5 times with someone. If not the possibility of sitting down in the cafe and having coffee, or going to their flat, or they're coming to mine. So I mean, it was a great sort of liberation when that was finally possible in a limited way. Or I remember they allowed us they allowed us to see other people on Christmas Eve, and for example, and so and actually to have Christmas Eve dinner with another person or other people, rather than only meeting outdoors and during the day. And that I remember just how important that was.
Yeah, Christmas last year we had a restriction on groups of more than 6, so it had to be units of fewer than 6.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, one of my last meetings before the lockdown happened was, of course, with you, Kartika, in Paris, when I was visiting, and then I come back to New York, and then the lockdown happened. So, it's very, very vivid in it. Meera Kamdar, writer based in Paris, she has this question that she thinks it's so moving to hear these entries with the dates, which mark moments in the pandemic we've all experienced in our own ways. Now, and it's a question, I think, to both of you. What is your sense as co-authors of the role of the dating of the tankas you each write and then send to the other? In other words, the way your exchange marks date by date a collective experience beyond your individual shared experience, riffing off each other.
I think we both did the dating once we began to put it together. I don't think we even questioned doing that for a minute, because it was, and it is, in fact, a chronicle of a very specific time, and whether it and those dates refer to what's happened. They refer to the lockdown here. They refer to the pandemic. They refer to things that are going on in each of our lives. I mean, very specifically to Kartika's cancer treatment and the progression of that. They also relate to what happened. I mean, in my case, to what happened in Lebanon after I had to leave there so quickly, and then a couple of months later, the city blew up, and many people I knew were still there and are still there. So those dates are, in that sense, are important, because they tie the poems to something more than just our interiorities. They also chronicle Kartika communicated with her parents on such and such a day, or managed to see her colleagues from the dance world, or that I took a walk with somebody who lives on the other side of the city, and because we arranged to meet in a park and do that, and the weather permitted.
It's an interesting thing. One of the very recurrent tropes I heard all through the pandemic was about the collapse of time. That time seemed to expand, but also collapse in a paradoxical way. And I didn't have that. One, because I had such a sustained hospital regimen, and there were the dates of that. But I think I also did not have that because I was dating every single thing quite really early, because I was saving Marilyn's emails onto a Word file with the dates. And anyway, email is such a great way. You have the timestamp on it, so you know precisely when when it was sent. Irrespective of when you read it, because sometimes I wasn't in a position to read immediately, and definitely not respond immediately. It felt important at a time when all the other, in French, as Mira knows, we have a very good word, repère, which sort of like landmarks or bearings. When all the other bearings went astray, it seemed really important to have at least time capsules.
Yeah, I now that you mentioned that, it really was a way that it marked the time, and not in a way, I mean, very specifically, it very often made the time bearable. I know how much I looked forward to opening the computer to find a new tagga for Kartika, and that would often be the most important and the most heartening event of the day.
Yeah, there's a comment, and actually, there's a question from Divya on the Facebook Live, and I thank colleagues at Pen Bookstore who are keeping track of these things and alerting me to that. I can't multitask, I can barely tie my shoelaces and think at the same time. But the question is from Divya, and it's: how did the Paris that you developed through forays and nostalgia relate to the reality of Paris when you saw it again? And I think it's a very interesting question, that you've been away from the streets in a way, except your immediate neighborhood, the park nearby where you're allowed to walk. And then the city opens up for you. What does it do to you? Did you inadvertently end up eulogizing a city that doesn't exist the same way anymore? In a sense, how has your natural habitat changed in the last year and more?
So I've never walked so much. It was, it was sort of obligatory because of the chemo. And that was also one of the reasons I saw so many of my friends, all those, who stayed on in town someone or the other came to take me on a daily walk. And because you can get bored of the same route, and because we had these medical certificates, which allowed us to go further than the compulsory radius of 1 kilometer, we walked and we walked and we walked. And so in a sense, I owned the city in a far more profound way than before. But there are poems which talk about going beyond. Say, we went to the time when we went onto the left bank, which we hadn't seen in a very long time. And those were significant moments. I remember watching the Netflix series Lupin and getting really emotional because there were parts of Paris which I hadn't seen in a very long time.
Mm. Right. And there's a question from Rebecca Walker, which is for all three of us, but you both should go first. This is your book and this event is for you, which is that you frequently collaborate with other poets and artists across culture. What draws you to working not just in your own community, but a wider global community?
You first.
I wish I could see them.
We can't. I think it's Facebook.
Sorry?
I think it's on Facebook.
Oh, it's on Facebook.
Yeah, it's on several streams, and I'm as I said, I can't multitask, but folks at Strand Bookstore are doing it for us. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. It's just hard to follow orally. When I can't see the question about collaborating.
I'll rephrase it. I'll rephrase it simplistically, and I'm apologies to Rebecca if I'm misinterpreting you. But the question is, what draws you to work not just within your community, but with a wider community beyond, global community?
Oh, well, I always think of I don't know. Well, I do know what, but of literature and perhaps of poetry in general as something. However specific it is, and often the more specific it is, the better it is, as something that is also always reaching out globally, and that somehow or other there can be echoes that go back and forth between a poem in a poem in Spanish from Guatemala and a poem in Arabic from Egypt that are in common, and all it takes is understanding the language or a good translation. And because I also do translate, that also means very often having my hand, having my mental hand and my mind engaged in a poem that's in a language that's not that isn't my mother, that isn't in my mother tongue, and transforming it, rendering it, bringing it back, or sometimes just reading it.
There are some folks who want you to read more poems, and we have about 6 minutes left. So I think I'm going to turn to you for poetry. If I have a choice, I mean, I would love to hear about the cardamom coffee, Marilyn, because I love it, and Karthika about migrant workers. But please don't feel imposed that this is all you have to read about. Take your pick, and let's have a bit of poetry before I ask my last question. Yeah.
Yeah, so just pick where you'd like to start. The cardamom coffee is 20th December.
Thank you.
But take your pick. You don't have to.
No.
I love cardamom coffee, but everyone may not. So yeah.
Okay.
So while Marilyn's finding the page, to complement the response to Rebecca, if I may, I came to poetry through dance. I'm a dance producer and dance writer. And there's no way one can make dance without collaborating. Like, even choreographers who compose their own scores work in collaboration. And what that has taught me is that we're so much, while we all have our individual creativity and our individual voices, sometimes it's just magical to be together. And because we inevitably share more than what separates us, there's also a great strength in discovering how we differ and in celebrating what we share, if that makes any kind of sense. It's just much more, even when it's complex, it's just much more rewarding.
I did indeed find it, and I would say that the Mimi in the poem is the British Iranian poet Mimi Khavati, who lives in London, who's a great friend. What I loved more than wine, pomegranate juice, or cardamom coffee was conversations. Her face or his face preferred language. Mine was often a shorba of three that seemed to have its own grammar, and history, none the same. I called Mimi today, she's locked down in London, and saw her silver mane, imperious nose, grin, thought of coffees and curries, voices, pages feed us now. 20th December 2020.
Your voice on the page, well, screens of laptop and cell phone, if precise, not poetic we should be, feeds me, thee, with mirth, thought, joy, doubt, absurdity, much needed, through the galloping months of this fearsome time. Not everyone knows why I have eluded faces, Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, WhatsApp, whatever, whenever possible. Last week, I lost my voice. Tears unspooled instead across video. 23rd December 2020.
Light out across the street, 5 stories of windows. The young black-bearded man at his computer screen. The small, long, dark-haired woman I remember as a 20 years ago bride, all eclipsed. And you aren't far away, but the Gare du Nord might be Beijing, though if I launch a bottle of syllables, one will return on the tide of the internet in one more possible morning. 26 December 2020.
One more loss to mourn. Usman C, stage name Babson, soft-hearted giant, says the press. King of the style christened house, master mover, choreographer, champion of girl power. Your young blood, your queen blood, paean to women with 8 danseuses dynamos, sized space and time, and a much esteemed international jury's presumptions. Come back. You'd just begun. Your brick red beat must sear sightlines for long. 31st December 2020.
Wouldn't the lines be long at any clinic if they vaccinated there? And wouldn't it be worth the wait? Instead, at temps prolongé, alone in winter, nervous in a cluttered flat, waiting for the light of day of the next season of another person's face. 4th January 2021.
Wear another face this year. I tell 2021. One will fear less, if not quite love at first sight. It lengthens, this wait to be shielded like shadows at dusk. Or is this the cotangent the sun casts at dawn? The streets of Paris, cobblestone and bitumen and spit, have no answers to give me as I tread from 10th to 11th, 4th to 5th. But they console. We've seen worse. 8th January 2021.
Thank you so much. In this book, you have taken us into your homes in Paris, into your minds, but also taken us beyond. Madeleine, you've never fought shy. You never stopped from taking us to the streets of Middle East and folks who live there and sometimes in Norway and Scandinavia and all that because of exile, the condition that is imposed on us. And while you are ensconced in your apartment. At the same time, you're able to be with them and recount their stories. And you're also telling us about the personal protection equipment, which folks in your family have to use because of the very important work that they do. Kartika, you told us about your own ailment, your illness, and how people rallied around that from the medical profession and your friends. And still, the compassion within you wasn't restricted to what was happening to you, but to what was happening to migrant workers in India and people who are fighting for the right to be taken seriously as individuals, as citizens. And you challenge that. And it's those two stirring voices that have come together in this book. So I urge everyone who's listening to this to read the poems, buy it if you're willing to do so. I learned a lot about Paris. I learned a lot about Kartika. I learned a lot about Marilyn, and I'm privileged for that. So thank you for that. And I'm going to now turn it over to Sabir. Yeah.
Thank you, Salil.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd also like to echo Marilyn and Karthika's thanks, Salil. Thank you so much for shepherding such a fantastic conversation. Marilyn, Karthika, it was such a pleasure and an honor to have you both, even if it's just virtually next time you're in the city.
Next time in person, yes, Sabir.
Yes, please.
Yes.
I would love it.
Yes. And you can give me a cookie and coffee, yeah, Sabir?
Oh, yes. And I want the cardamom coffee recipe myself. But to our audience, thank you for joining us this evening or this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. If you haven't purchased a distance yet, there are links in the chat. I've also, if you're watching via Facebook, there's a link in the comment thread. And for everyone who registered via Eventbrite, you'll be emailed the link tomorrow again. So on that note, thank you everyone, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.